Hi, I am Bobby with Writer Space, and today we are here with Sherryl Woods and Mara Purl. And we have a lot to talk about because Sherryl and Mara both write small town romance series. Uh, Many of you may be familiar with Sherryl, who writes the Sweet Magnolias series, which is also on Netflix. And we get to meet Mara and learn very much about her interesting history. So I'm really excited to talk about this. But I'm going to ask them very briefly to introduce themselves. We'll start with Sherryl. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your books, as if we
Well,
don't know.
I have done 148 books until I decided people had heard enough from me, and I've done many series for during my career with Harlequin or Mirror Books and Silhouette and all the different companies that I worked for, some of which I killed along the way. And I had to fight when I first started trying to write series because there was a panic that if people didn't like the first one and I was committed to two or three, they would not continue reading. And so I really fought to get the series going. And in that era, Robin Carr and a few others, Susan Mallory, all of us came along at about the same time, and Debbie Maycomer, and we finally got it through their heads that people loved reading about continuing characters and continuing small town places and things like that.
Agreed. And Mara.
I'm Mara Purl, and I write the Milford Haven novels. And I really resonate with everything Sherryl just said. And the appetite that both viewers, listeners, and readers have for series, I think, was really well established before publishers were quite ready to go along with that idea. And there were some reasons that were explained to me, but the focus really is the readers. And when you love characters, you absolutely want to find out what they do next. So I started sort of backwards, you might say, in that I think the normal thing is that you write books, and then if they're fantastic and you meet the right producers, then those wonderful series go to television, like Chesapeake Shores and Sweet Magnolias that Sherryl created. I started writing scripts, though. And so I had a hit radio drama, and I had a few markets in the US, and then I had a surprise because it was picked up by the BBC. And we were excited, but we didn't know if that would work because we were up against some of the best radio dramas in the English language. But the producer called after the first 6 weeks, and she said, "You might like to pop over. It's doing rather well."
Yeah.
And so it turned out that we had 4.5 million listeners in the UK. So it became sort of a phenom. And that in turn eventually led to interest from publishers. So that was the start of my journey.
So you tell us the timeline of this because the books are actually set in the 90s. So when did the radio show come out? And
Well, in the 90s.
oh, so it
And
was.
so
Okay.
I like to say that after 30 years, I'm an overnight success.
In the
That's true
publishing
for a lot
world.
of us. That the overnight success factor was not so overnight.
Not so much.
Yes.
But the storyline was dealing with. I have always found that in our society, when we come sort of up to the end of a century, there's a great deal of energy and a lot of interesting things happen. It happened in the 1890s, and it happened in the 1990s. And so that's when the original story was set, and I decided to keep it there. And it's so interesting trying to write such recent history. Some things are much the same, and some things are very different, like cell phones. Well,
Right.
obviously, cell phones now are such a fact of life. You can't write anything without including them. But way back in the day, a few people had cell phones, but for the most part, you had to either wait at home for that phone call or be able to check your voice machine, your tape, And so behavior was a little bit different, and expectations about careers and so forth were a little bit different. So there's a nuance.
So one of the things I mentioned that I was going to be asking you about was, so you referred, Sherryl, to the effect of being, after 20 years being an overnight success. And I've heard the same thing from Robin Carr, who's another sort of pioneer of the small town series romances. So tell us a little bit about your experience, both in publishing and then kind of how, like, you were one of the biggest names in my mind at a certain period of time in the romance industry. And then it sort of felt like you took a step back, and then it became these television shows, and now sort of your career is in a different direction. But tell us about how you experienced those experiences, if that makes sense.
Well, I'm not sure how I experienced those experiences exactly, but one of the things that I think is interesting about the small town romance is if you look at today's book sales, and there was an article in today's New York Times that my TV agent sent me about the death of mass market paperbacks and how that has changed. And also at the same time, there has been a little bit of a death because of the death of mass market of the series romances. And one of the things that led me to write series to begin with were I grew up on soap operas, and I wanted to sort of compare notes with Mara about this because she was not only wrote a soap drama, so to speak, but was on a soap opera. And that greatly influenced my storytelling and wanting to tell continuing stories. I mean, I grew up at a time, my mom listened to soaps on the radio. So I listened. I listened to the radio all the time with her when I was very little.
Oh,
And when I was covering television as a reporter, I was one of the few that went in and interviewed soap actors and actresses because I was fascinated by that industry. And I remember at one point interviewing Don Stewart, who was on The Guiding Light at that time. And I went into New York, and it was a show that I'd watched, and I had even listened to it on the radio with my mom. And I had lunch with him, and he said, "Well, do you want to go back to the set?" And in his mind, because I was a reporter, I was a professional television critic coming into the set. I went nuts. I became Sherry fandom. And I'm running around, oh my God, it's Sarah's living room. It's Ed's office. I mean, I was completely, into this. And that same enthusiasm went into the writing of the books. And I think in that era, readers were coming out of that same joy of going back day in and day out, and women had a different lifestyle. More of them were at home and they were listening. And just as soaps have faded on the TV screen, while they influence the books, I think they have also faded there. And I'm thinking that part of that is today's, people for a long time wanted that simpler life of knowing their neighbors and all the small town mystique that if you lived in a large city, you just sort of longed for that simpler time and that kind of a place and the connections and everything. And now I'm thinking the world is so crazy everywhere that maybe that's why readers are turning to more of the fantasy worlds, which don't mirror the craziness of the world today. But I'm wondering, Mara, with you, if that same thing has influenced the way you approached writing your dramas because of that soap connection, so to speak.
oh, absolutely. I totally agree, and I'm so glad you brought this up. Yes, I was on Days of Our Lives, and I worked with such great people. I must say, I was a snob before I got that job, and I thought, oh, soap opera, you know. I
Yeah.
mean, I was a classically trained Shakespearean actress. What did I want to do with a soap opera? And I had this, my agent said, "You're going to meet the casting director of Days of Our Lives." Yes, ma'am. Well, I was so impressed with her. She was this wise woman, and I just thought, oh, wow, if I could work, if this is the work ethic I'm really interested in. By the time I got home, the phone was ringing, and she said, now it's a smaller part, and if you want to wait till there's a bigger one, I said, no, I would love to take this job. And so the directors were wonderful. The discipline was something else. It's a
Yes.
6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And you have, it's very much like theater, because in other forms of television, and particularly cinema, you have sometimes a chance for a second take, and that doesn't happen in the soap
Yeah.
opera world. You you have to know your lines, you have to know what you're doing, where you're going, and really be prepared. But what I fell in love with was a longer form of storytelling. And I think that's kind of what Cheryl was pointing to,
Yeah.
that everything doesn't wrap up in 2 hours any more than it does in our real lives.
Right. Exactly.
Right. And so there's that sense of, it may take me a while, me, this character, take me a while to figure this out. But that's okay. Step by step, I'll have the conversations I need to have. I'll get the lessons that I require. And so, storytelling for me in my series, I think, is about unwinding our snarls. You're going along in life, and then you come to this big knot, and then you have to decide, okay, I'm going to ignore that, or I'll come back to it later, or I'll try to leap over it. But sometimes you say, you know what, I have to deal with this right now. Those are the choices that characters make as we go along. And I just find that fascinating. I know Cheryl and I are both fascinated by human beings,
Yeah.
by the choices that people make. And I really think that is iconic and permanently embedded in human nature. And so, no matter what forms come and go, I think that we're always going to want that sort of core problem solving and quiet victories, that you can just have a good day because you saw your way through one important issue. You got one step closer to being the person you really want to be.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I think too that with soap operas, one of the things that fascinated me was what you were saying about how much you have to learn lines. And I remember at some point, I can't remember which actor it was, but somebody was a big name on screen, and they would bring in people like that on soaps once in a while to do guest roles. And when they realized how much dialogue people had to memorize and all that kind of thing, it was a whole eye-opening kind of
Oh,
adventure.
there's one other thing to that too, which is that the Tuesday show is strangely like the Monday show. And
Yeah.
so, you know, you reach a point, it's like, oh my gosh, I'm in the wrong script. I'm saying the wrong line. Because sometimes things just get, because they work so hard not to chew through too much story per day, because you're on every day.
Right. Yeah. I know. I know. Well, yeah, the whole storytelling pattern is very different. But what you were saying too about the development of the character over time, and one of the questions I've been asked a lot ever since the Chesapeake Shores series and the Sweet Magnolia series were adapted for TV is, why don't the storylines match exactly? Why is it that there's this
Right.
difference? And I think that, you will find this to be true when you start dealing with it. And maybe it was even the reverse from the radio to the books. But I tell people all the time, I wrote the stories about the characters at this particular moment in their lives. And television takes those stories and takes them on into the future, just like we live life. I mean, the people you meet today are different a year from now than they were when you met them.
So true.
And all those kind of things really, you know, make a difference if you can actually think that. And one of the people who was on Sweet Magnolias did a horror book a year or so ago, and he and his writing partner came into Colonial Beach, Virginia, where I spend my summers, to do an event last summer. And the writing partner is a psychiatrist, And I was talking about the fact that, you let go of your characters and the producers and writers take them into this whole new thing. And he looks at me and he nods and he says, Sherry, that's a very healthy attitude. So I'm glad to know that there's at least one shrink in the world that thinks I'm normal. It's like I wouldn't want to test too many others, but
Um,
Also, yeah,
I want to step in here because we have a few comments and I think you should hear a couple of them. So,
right.
Christina says, thank you for joining us. We are excited too for this. Christina said, so excited for this one. And Mary Lou Belly has put a few comments in. I'm not going to say them all, but she said, oh my goodness, only 6 degrees of separation. I did Music Man in New York with Don Stewart.
oh,
Um,
Oh,
oh my gosh.
And then when we get to make these connections, it makes us feel the world is not so large and we come together in new ways, which is something I want to riff on in a moment. But she also said, wondering if either of these authors were fans of serial storytelling similar to Dickens.
yes. What a great thing to ask, Mary Lou. Um, well, first of all, I kind of grew up on Dickens. My father was a theater man. He was second generation. I'm third generation. Dad went to Yale Drama School. He performed Scrooge annually. So in my household, we knew a lot about Dickens. And Dickens was so interesting because he performed pieces of his longer novels. So these were dramatic readings, kind of a combination of literature and theater. And I think, in a way, that's what we are still doing, following that really interesting pattern of saying, here's a window, like Sherry was saying, at this moment in time of this character. And then we're going to come back to them some days, weeks, months later and see what's developed and where they are. And I think that's a fantastic way of telling stories.
Yeah. One thing that struck me there is that people tend to be either right brain or left brain writers. And left brain writers who do mysteries mostly are very precise and they plot everything out. And I'm totally right brain. I mean, if I come to a place in writing a book and I need a new character, I just pick a name out of a hat and I throw them in there. And I may not, because authors or readers would say all the time, why did this character's name change between book 1 and book 2? It's because I didn't remember what I named him in book 1.
Oh,
And you don't have the same editor all the time. So, and they were always very polite because they would attribute it to a bad editor. And I'd say, oh no, that was me. That was me.
mhm.
But I do think that stream of consciousness kind of writing, it can get you into trouble, but it's also so much more fun to do. Is that when you sit down and you jump into a book and you want to see where it's going and how those characters are going to develop and who's going to be in the next book. You may not know when you start is that the character that's going to be the hero or heroine of the next book is there until they like jump off the page and tell you, hey, my turn.
Well, there is this dialogue amongst authors. Are you an outliner or are you a pantser?
Yeah. Yeah.
For those who don't know the term, a pantser is somebody who writes from the seat of their pants.
Yeah.
And I think in the style of writing, because actually Cheryl and I have a lot of similarities in our series, I think we do both. I have an outline. I know which characters are going to be involved. And after all, I'm adapting from an existing show for which I created what's called a show Bible. So I had a way of tracking. When I was writing the scripts for the radio show, I actually got in trouble once where I had my character in the same, in 2 different places at the same time. I didn't want that to happen again. So I have some tracking mechanisms. But then there are times you get into the flow of the story, and the flow is all important, and you want to let it take you.
Yeah.
Otherwise, your story can become kind of choppy if you interrupt yourself too much.
Right. I had a friend when I lived on Key Biscayne who called me one day and he said, what are you up to? And I said, I'm waiting for my characters to start talking to me. And he says, Sherry, don't tell that to a mental health professional. But I think that's true, Mari. I'm sure you have the same thing, is that at any given moment, and hopefully at the beginning of a book rather than halfway through it, you can start hearing them in your head. Because I used to do a lot of the writing for my books because I was still working a real job on my drive to work. And I would get to my office and I would jot down 17 notes of conversations that I'd had in my head on the way to work. And then when I sat down to actually write for the 3 days a week that I was allowed to write back then, I had all these chunks of the story. And it's a wonderful experience as a writer when they're that real to you that you start hearing them.
Oh, I totally agree. I had a friend who used to say, "Good night, everyone."
Yeah.
Down in my head. Yeah, but it's
Um,
true. Go ahead.
Sorry. So I wanted to ask you a question about the way you write these. And I have not read all of your books, Mara, but I did read the prequel to
Mhm.
your series. And when I looked at the descriptions of the other books, it feels to me like Miranda is really the main character of the series, and then
True.
all the other people sort of revolve around her.
Mhm.
Whereas with a series like Sweet Magnolias, so I feel like in the original books, each book had a main character, and
Right.
I mean, the way they do the series is definitely more integrated. Um, so I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you, well, you, Mara, number one, she's an artist, and I was very, your writing was really beautiful about how her artistry in being an artist, right? And the way that she saw the world and the way that she looked at the beauty of the world around her, which I thought was just lovely, and you put it that way very well. So tell us a little bit about how you pick the characters you're going to write about, and then the amount of research that you do that you're representing them well enough. So for, like, Sherryl, you have a baseball player, and you open up a spa, right? And Mara has the artist who's the main character, but then there's an astronaut, and there's a um, her sister is sort of a finance person, and you have to write with broad strokes, but you can't write with broad strokes if you don't understand something about the world that these characters actually live in. So, would you mind talking a little bit about that?
Oh, I bet both of us would love to jump in there. I'll start. Um, the radio show, I would say, was much more of an ensemble cast. But when it came to moving into narrative voice, I needed to have a protagonist. And Miranda is a lonely person in a way. She comes from privilege and the lovely parents and a wonderful sister, none of whom understand her. They don't understand the arts. And so this puts her in this sort of isolated place emotionally. In that prequel is when she begins to chafe and recognize that something is out of sync and that she needs to take action, takes a drive, finds this little town and moves, and everyone in her immediate circle thinks she's really lost her mind. So she gets no support for that. But what happens during her journey, which we discover in the series, she connects particularly with two other women, one of whom is sort of a mentor because she's a bit older. She's an environmentalist, and that's an interest that they share. The other has had a much more difficult life than Miranda has had. She's from the South. It doesn't come from money. It's kind of a hard scrabble life, and she's just salt of the earth. Now, interesting that in Sweet Magnolias, it's also three women. It's this wonderful dynamic of close women friends that I think is just key, certainly to my life, to the lives of, I would say, my close women friends, how we value each other, how we understand each other. And so I really wanted to bring that, into the story. And I'll just segue to research. Some of probably what everybody writes is to some degree autobiographical. And so I also had something like that journey, coming from a wonderful family, but having to kind of leave everything that was comfortable, strike out on my own, find my own voice. I think that's an iconic, probably as iconic as Homer's Odyssey. You know, everyone has to find their own journey. And so there's that research. I have grandparents from farms, and that sense of coming from the earth and uh, being kind of this, that sense of the South and how important it is to know some of these basics. That was important in my family, and I love that I get to bring that in. And then research wise, wow, I bet both Cheryl and I could talk about this all day. We both are former journalists. And so we really know how to do research and take it seriously. I sometimes have to say, oh, okay, Pearl, you got to stop researching now.
Yeah.
But, you know, you study, I've had to study quite a bit about painting, about financial advice, about astronomy, about many of the different careers that are represented in my series. I learned so much. I love that. And I don't want to present any wrong information to my readers. I like the idea that as they read, they're having fun and, you know, maybe learning something too. So over to you, Cheryl.
Well, as you know, I'm certainly capable because of the journalism background, because you're right. You want to know, you want it to be accurate. You want to know enough to make it real. But a friend of mine said to me once that I was the only person he knew who could stop at an airport and write a book about that town, because it was like from the point of the airport, I could do enough research to create the flavor and make it believable, and you learn to talk to the right people. And a lot of my research would be, I remember on one particular book there were apple groves, and I didn't know anything about growing apple. I went to the children's section and got those books, which explained it in a much less complex way, that what I needed to know and what I needed to communicate. Because for me, the characters are there. I'm always more interested in the emotional journey than the peripheral stuff, unless it plays a vital role in who they are. And for instance, Cal in Sweet Magnolias, his baseball career was what had dominated his life. And when he lost that, then that became the important driving force of who he was, not so much when he was on the field. And I did a talk once with people who had book groups could win a chat with me, which at the time I couldn't Zoom, which I still can't really do very well. And why this camera is moving all over the place and my hands are moving all over the place. It's like, oh,
You did great.
not so good. But when I did the book talk, they said, "You seem to have a lot of baseball players in your books." And I said, "Well, let's see. My first crush when I was 12 was a little league baseball player. My dad played semi-pro baseball, so I was around baseball all my life, and I still, as an adult." I was living in Columbus, Ohio, and had just become a television critic. And my mom was able in Virginia to get, because the senators had left Washington at that time, and she still loved baseballs, but she was able to get on the radio the Cincinnati Reds games. And she wanted me to meet Johnny Bench and, if possible, marry him. And I mean, she was very clear about it. And of course, I had no reason to go actually meet Johnny Bench. But then he, bless his little heart, he did a Bob Hope Christmas tour. So I scheduled an interview, went down to Cincinnati and met Johnny Bench, did not marry him. But I did take my mom to a spring training game that he gave us tickets for. And she got hit by a pitched ball, and it was the best souvenir she ever got. She had this bruise the size of I don't know what, on her leg, and she thought that was the best souvenir she'd ever gotten. So, but yeah, I think that part of what you do is you've got to immerse yourself, or you've got to have that human understanding of what a career plays and how you're using it in a book. And it can be very different from book to book. Sometimes it really matters, sometimes not so much. Um, if that's not the focus of their life, it's getting them to a point where they find what the focus of their life is going to be. Maybe it's that what they're doing now is not where they belong, and how do they find that, and what makes them human in that capacity.
So I would like to go back a little bit to series. And one of the things I find it really interesting that you said, Sherryl, when you were trying to do a series, that they were like, no, no, don't do series. But now that's become really the standard, right? And in fact, you have someone like Sherry Thomas, who wrote a whole bunch of sort of standalone historical romance novels, and the publisher went back and kind of created a series around them so she could move forward in series. So it sounds like you both, when you were thinking about these series, you definitely planned them out in that way. I mean, obviously you were writing a radio play, so you had to have enough pieces that it kept going. And then you turned them into books. So Sherry, tell us about how it was to sort of, and I find your journey very fascinating, because romance has completely changed since you started writing romance, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, but back when you were starting, it was almost like there was category romance, and then there were these sort of single title things sometimes, and you sort of captured both sides of that in a sense, I think. And then you and Robin Carr and Susan Mallory and people like that sort of shifted the way that romance was written, because it definitely, I feel, became more series oriented
Right.
rather than single title oriented.
Right. Well, when I started writing, I was writing category romance, and which was actually an ideal training ground for somebody coming out of journalism, because in journalism, you had interviews, you had all of that information, and you had to tell the story in a very concise manner. And so, category romance for me was two main characters and a plot line, and not that many secondary characters and so on. And unfortunately, at that time, it was also it started out, the first couple of books I wrote were much like the early Harlequins, not very sexy, very simple, type A males and that kind of thing. And then they all were turning to silhouette desires and candlelight ecstasy and things like that. And although I learned to do that, and I learned to write about the two characters, I wanted more story. I wanted more and evolved more towards women's fiction, partly because I wasn't very good at writing desires. I was a terrible desire writer because I figured everybody knew how sex worked. And I did not need to spend a lot of time telling them that. And so I closed a lot of doors. There were a lot of people who went off into a room and never to be seen again. But but then I started doing special editions, and it was a bigger platform, and so I learned to write fiction. I remember the first time I sat down to write, and I'm looking at my computer. Well, actually, I was looking at my typewriter and the blank piece of paper, and I said, "Where are my quotes? Where are my facts?" And somebody said, to somebody out of journalism where that was important, they said, "You get to make it up." Well, daggone. Okay, that opened up a whole new world. And once I got started, I couldn't seem to stop, apparently. But then I evolved more towards women's fiction, where I wanted to tell the journey that women were taking, sort of what Meryl was talking about, that internal journey that people take as women, and as they grow and define themselves and find out who they really are beyond the expectations of who they should be, and all that kind of thing. And it moved, as Robin did, and as Susan Mallory, all of us started and Debbie Maycomer, we all started in category, and then started writing more with more complexity and more insight, hopefully, and more depth. And the series allowed us to do that with even more depth. and to keep those stories going and continue with the characters. And we all do it a little bit in different ways. I mean, Mara in different ways, like she has Miranda goes through the books, and I'm on the third one now. And, as her journey continues, you're getting bits and more of the other characters. Whereas in mine, the next, those characters that she talked about, those three women characters, would have each had their own particular book with Miranda's story fading back into the background, but still a part of it. Just like on Sweet Magnolias, we've got those three main characters. And from a script perspective, they all have a certain balance in every episode, but you can tell whose story is in the forefront right this minute and whose story is sort of in the background, just like soap operas,
Mm-hmm.
where, different characters' stories are in the foreground any given day, and then they're in the background for a couple of days. Then they're not on camera for a day, maybe, and then they come back. That's how they keep you hooked.
Yeah. You know, oh, it's just it's so interesting. Um, Romance, I think, was so important when in those early days to create a breakthrough for women authors.
Yes.
And it seemed to me that it happened first in romance, where the publishing industry had to pay attention because these writers were making names for themselves and seriously selling books. And so for that, I think any, woman author owes a debt of gratitude to those early romance days. When I came into the book chapter of my writing career, um, I couldn't really write the what I call the predictable ending very well. And I know that that has greatly irritated some of my readers because at the end of book one, hey, where's that happy ending? And it isn't there. Instead, it's like, well, darn, I have to keep reading. And the happy ending, we do get to the happy endings. I have now finished, the whole six of the core novels, and we have some wonderful weddings in the last two books. And so everything does eventually resolve. But I suppose that resembles my life more closely. I didn't get that happy ending right away by any means. There were a couple decades of misadventures romantically that I had to go through before that happened. And so I have visited that same pain upon my characters. Um, but the thing is, romance eventually has expanded to become women's fiction, which is
Yeah.
more complex, and it deals not only with the romantic storyline, but with everything,
Right.
with a woman's career, her friendships, where she lives, what she's up to in the world, maybe politics, family dynamics, all of that. And I mean, when I speak to book clubs and women's groups and so forth, we are so such great multitaskers and probably far too busy. I mean, one of my questions that I ask is, are you even on your to-do list? And all of us have to say, no. So that's part of the storytelling too, that prioritizing. I know for Miranda, she worries in that first book. Somebody likely comes along, but she has now fought so hard to find her own career and her own place. She worries that connecting romantically with somebody at this point might cause her to sort of backslide and give up this fresh new identity that she's just coming to know. So I love how that rich complexity really turns up in women's fiction, which I think is really kind of what we're up to now.
Right. Well, and but Bobby, just let me interrupt before I
No,
know
go
you
ahead.
guys ready to go. You're ready to go. But one of the things that Mara said about women authors and the early romance books and so on, what was interesting about that time is this is what happens when you're old. I was there at the beginning of time, it seems like, um, with Harlequin and Silhouette in particular, was the authors were not the identity as far as they were concerned. It was the series. They were convinced that it was Silhouette Desire that was selling, or Harlequin Romance that was selling. And those books that were in the store, people, they didn't care who the author was. And then over a period of time, particular authors, particularly, you had to be prolific in order to stand out and get that identity separate from what they considered to be the real identity, which was that logo on the front of the book and the particular series you were involved with, whether special edition or Candlelight Ecstasy or Love Inspired and Love Swept and all those kinds of things. So it took a while within that romance genre for authors to actually pop out and become something that mattered. I think readers figured that out a whole lot sooner than the publishers did.
Well, I mean, I could talk about the romance industry for hours, so I will. This is not my show; it's your show. But I definitely feel like I think the way women read back in the day was very different, also because it was the first time that they had books written for them.
Right.
And also written by them, right? I mean, that's what Nora Roberts always says, the genre written for, by, and about women, which had never happened before and has, definitely evolved. But if you talk to some authors also, like, one of the interesting things that happened is if you were outside of category, like a Catherine Woodwiss or, something like that, like everybody was reading that book. And it wasn't like, oh, that's a romance, not, it was a bodice ripper. But at that time, or like I remember like Lace, I don't know if you remember that show from the 80s, but like everybody read that book, or a Danielle Steele, or a Judith Krantz, right? Like everybody was reading those books and they weren't really thinking about them as women's fiction or romance, or they were just sort of these epic storytelling, like love fests. I don't know, whatever. But I think we read differently now, and and writers write differently, but also it's all there's such a much broader existence of the kinds of books that you can read. And I think that's like, I think it's kind of almost derogatory to like what we think of as romance, because a lot of romance now, if it isn't category, it's more women's fiction, even though it's like an Emily Henry or something like that. Like they're bigger books. Mm-hmm. They're broader storytelling. So romance and women's fiction are in some ways are kind of blurred. But the good news is there's a lot more books that we have the opportunity to read, which did not exist back then. Does that make sense? Like there's so much. It's amazing.
Well, that's the effect, I think, of self-publishing and all of the various options now with digital and things like that people have to choose and can spend their money on, which is what's fascinating about this sort of demise of mass market, is the price point that people are willing to get fewer books and spend more money on them in trade or hardcover. They're not getting the numbers out that they were in mass market and in category romance for a while and all that kind of thing. But they are so many other options as far as what's available digitally or with audiobooks and so on.
Right. Well, and then you have like special editions, right? Like you have like more options even within the sort of traditional publishing genre. You have like 5 more options. For the good and the bad. It's sometimes overwhelming, but it's also great, But I also find that readers really do follow authors. Right, which is back to your point that you were saying, like back in the day, they didn't really think about that. But, if you were a discerning reader, you knew when Nora Roberts' book was coming out, even when she was writing category, right?
Right.
Like, it is sort of fascinating.
There are a couple of elements of life that are so different now. One is just velocity.
Yeah.
Life is happening very, very fast. And so there's this binge factor, binge reading, binge viewing. And sometimes while I was in the process of coming out with a book a year, I had readers who didn't want to embark on the series until it was all published.
Yeah.
Right.
And so now, we've been announcing now you can binge the whole series. In fact, we even came out with a boxed set. So, kind of to signal you won't be hung up for the rest of the year waiting, for the next chapter. So, I think that's part of it. And I also think that silos is sort of a factor now. And we want to trust before we embark on a new series or spend our money. You want to have a feeling that the author is trustworthy. And that's where recommending other authors comes into play so importantly. Um, I was in a Barnes and Noble signing, and I heard these two readers who obviously were serious about their reading, and they had already carrying several books in their arms. One of them said, "Oh, look, there's an author signing." And the other one said, "Well, I don't know who she is. I don't want to read somebody I don't know."
Yeah.
And I thought, yeah. So if I could tell her, well, if you enjoy Robin Carr, I'm pretty sure you're going to enjoy my books, then she might take a chance,
Right.
And also we were laughing earlier about I cannot write as quickly as my readers can read.
Well, yeah, and you get the same impact with television because viewers are impatient too for
Yeah.
the next season. And, gone for the most part are the days of regular network television where a series had maybe 26 episodes in a year, and now you may have 10. And then there's a space in between them, and they're available to binge watch. I can't tell you how frustrated I was the first season of Sweet Magnolias when it came on, and we were doing this live event the afternoon after it dropped. And by the time we did the show, everybody had, I mean, not everybody, but a huge number of people had already binge watched the whole series. I was still watching episode 2 because I
Oh,
grew up in the era when you watched a show once a week.
once a week.
And
Yeah.
that concept of watching all 8, 10 shows right in a day or two, it's like, well, what now?
Yeah.
So
Well, of course, your series are so
we are a
good.
very impatient group these days, I'll tell you.
I will say that your series are so beautifully produced and directed, and the cast, and they're so well written and everything, that they are absolutely worth watching all over again, and maybe a third time, because it's always surprising what you've missed.
Oh, yeah.
And when you binge watch, I think you're just sort of getting the plot line,
Right.
but
Right.
you're missing a lot of the nuance. And so, yeah. And hopefully that's also true with our books.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I will say the casting on your series, Sherryl, the chemistry among especially the 3 main characters is just wonderful.
Outstanding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're very good.
Yeah. It's a very fun watch. So I guess I should ask, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't ask, Mara, is that an aspiration of yours to have a Netflix series or Amazon?
Absolutely. I've gone through, a couple of rounds over the years of having those discussions. Actually, it's we really are kind of on the cusp right now. So I don't have anything yet to announce, but you'll be the second person I'll tell. I'm going to tell Sherryl first.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So I do want to ask you, Mara, because I sort of touched on this, but didn't exactly. What inspired you back in the day to write this story? I mean, in the 90s, this was not something you saw a lot of, I would say, even as a um, a radio
Radio drama.
play, but
Yeah. Oh, it
it's
was a fascinating journey, Bobby. I thank you for asking. So let's see. I was on Days of Our Lives in the 80s, and um, I fell in love with this form of storytelling. Then I was invited to a small town to spend a summer performing in a lovely little playhouse. Now, I grew up in Tokyo, then I lived in New York and then Los Angeles. So I sure was an expert at small towns. It was such a
Yeah.
novelty to spend the summer. So in the evenings, I was busy in the show, and by day, I was just interviewing people, researching, just like, life in a small town. And I thought, what a great framework, what a great microcosm for storytelling. And so, when the summer concluded and I went back to LA, this was like Sherryl, balancing. I was doing temp work and performing and sort of making a living by doing both of these things. But I really got hooked by this story idea. So every night I was pounding out, you know, outlines and scripts. There was a man who owned a tiny radio station in the town where I was performing, and he came backstage. He said, "Hey, if you ever want to do something for radio, you let me know." So that was also ticking over in the back of my mind. And again, like Cheryl, in growing up in Tokyo, we were shadow audience for Armed Forces Radio, who broadcast old radio dramas like Suspense. And I loved those. And so somehow this all coalesced. And so I sent some scripts to this radio station owner, and but I didn't hear anything back. And when I called, the phone number had changed. And so I thought I better find out what's going on. So I drove up there. It's about 4 hours from LA. And the radio station had changed. He and his wife had a little pot of coffee on and little cute curtains. And now there were some men behind a desk wearing beards and smoking marijuana. And the walls were festooned with rock and roll posters. And so I said, is Wally here? Oh, no, he sold the station. Oh, well, I've been sending scripts. Milford Haven. Oh, yeah, Milford Haven. Yeah, we've been throwing those away. Oh. So I had about one more minute, and I said, well, do you have a rate card? Yeah, we have a rate card. And I said, so if I got sponsors? And then they were like, sponsors? Ah. So, Bobby, I walked up and down the little main street and I went into stores and I said, if I did a radio station show, a drama, would you be interested? And, they knew me from Days of Our Lives and they knew me from the play. And so a lot of them said yes. So I came back to the station with commitments for money. And they said, you're on the air. And I said, oh, but when? And I had to rush back to LA, find a recording studio where I still became a partner and I still work there. Find cast members, and I invited people from other, Days, As the World Turns, Another World, it's kind of a community of soap actors, many of whom said yes, and we got rolling. And so it became a local hit, which was really fun. But then I thought, but it really should, it's local interest. I wonder if it would work elsewhere. And so that became that journey. Life is funny.
Yeah, you never know.
So I know you do a podcast. So this is a great time to let me say here, tell us the name of your podcast.
It's called Novel Conversations.
Novel Conversations. And have you ever thought about doing I know you're sort of headed in a lot of different directions with this, potentially on television and also the books. Have you ever thought about doing this again as sort of a radio play for your podcast, or is that maybe in the works? Or even like Amazon Audible? Because I know that they do things like that now. Maybe I
They
shouldn't say
had a
anything.
system, a wonderful system of delivering serial stories, which they have closed actually. Um,
Oh,
all my all the books are, except for the very latest one, which I'm about to record, are on Audible as audiobooks. I would love to share those original radio dramas. I mean, the cast was marvelous. We have original music by these terrific composers. It's sort of a matter of time management. My priority is meeting my book deadlines.
right.
But yes, I would love to do that. Um, so we'll see.
Very cool. I don't really see uh, lots of great Sweet Magnolias TV series, amazing and good cast. Mary Lou Belly thinks you're hysterical. She said that a few times.
Oh, and I see
um,
we have Mary Helsapple. I have to do a shout out for her. She is a very well known painter, and with juried shows on Madison Avenue, and she won an Emmy. I mean, she's just outstanding. And I dared to ask if she'd be interested in doing the art for my book covers. And she
oh,
said yes. So each book cover is a painting. In the story, it's a painting, of course, that Miranda has done. But behind the scenes, behind the curtain, it's really Mary Helsapple who does these gorgeous paintings. So thank you for.
oh. And she says Mara has the most incredible narration voice. I've enjoyed several. So, and I also think you did a great job on the narration. So,
Thank you.
I mean, coming from the acting world, one would hope that that would be the case, but it isn't always. So, you did a good job.
Thank you. It's fun.
um,
It's very fun.
so we are sort of almost out of time for our allotted hour. I don't usually have a problem going a little bit over. I do want to say that this will be on the Writer Space Facebook page. It's a Facebook Live, so you can go back and watch. I think they keep them up now for 30 days. So, Mary, you can definitely go watch from the beginning. It's recorded. I always like to end these with book recommendations. I don't know if you are willing to do that as well, but I've kind of already said the ones that I think of that represent books. I mean, obviously Robin Carr and Virgin River, and
Yes. Brilliant series.
it's really interesting. Susan Mallory, I think, is not doing sort of small town series anymore. She in my mind feels like she's going into single title. She usually has like a couple single titles a year. So, and I've been enjoying a lot of those. So if you like these books, you will probably also like those. Does anyone have anyone else or anyone else to recommend?
Well,
Yeah.
I've been reading because it's so hard to find the kind of women's fiction that I like to read. I've been reading a lot of sort of cozy mysteries, which have the same, if they're series, the same small town feel to them. And I just started a Cape Cod series by an author named Maddie Day that I like. And so I'm going to get ready. I go on Barnes and Noble and look to see who has multiple books in a series, and then I try them. And so I've ordered several of hers, and I think she has a couple of different series. But in terms of the traditional people, I mean, Nora Roberts did plenty of series over time before she started doing all sorts of, different kinds of genres and things like that. And Susan Wiggs did too early on, did some books in a small town in the Berkshires, I think it was. But there are a lot of authors out there, and hopefully, at least in ebooks, the books are still available, even if they're not in print in stores.
I will say that on the Nora Roberts side, she still tends to write series. She'll usually write a series of 3 or 4 books.
Right. A lot of trilogies, yeah.
Right.
A lot of trilogies. And they're lovely. Yeah, they're wonderful.
They're great.
Well, my number one favorite is somebody named Sherryl Woods. If you haven't read all of her series, you you get to go to this lovely place where you care about the characters, you laugh at their foibles, you learn, interesting things. Um, some other favorites, Rayanne Thane. I just
Yes.
love her series. She has this focus on healing, which I find really interesting. Is very authentic from her own experience, but she portrays it without a heaviness and in just a sense of possibility of what can happen in life. And Jill Shalvis is just so funny and fun, very sexy, um, and delightful. Just to sort of spend time with her. Um, and then lastly, I would say Tammy L. Grace, who writes just lovely, kind of clean series. Again, she has one series about a lavender farm, and it's a feel good place to go, and you learn things, and you fall in love with these characters. So those are
Yeah.
some of my favorites.
Yeah.
I would like to say, if you do not know Rayanne Thane, we do work with her. So if you'd like to meet her, we are happy to introduce you. And if you like all of these, I would also recommend, if you haven't discovered Michelle Major, she writes series as well, which I find really lovely. So that might be
Oh,
another.
well, I love, getting together with fellow authors and this lovely platform. Bobby, you all do so much for authors at Writer Space. I really appreciate it.
Oh, well,
Oh.
thank you. We
Are we
try.
are we going to send people over to the contests that are available too?
Yes. So just so you know, both of these lovely ladies are giving away a number of books. I believe both paper and electronic, and there are some that are open to international authors, or excuse me, readers. So the contest is on Sherryl Woods. It's housed on Sherryl Woods' page, which is sherrylwoods.com. And if you go to her navigation menu and you click on the contest, it will take you to that contest. So there you go. And we will also put it in on the Writer Space page in the comments of this conversation. So just so you know. Oh, well,
Great.
and they put it in the they also put it in the chat. So if anybody is in here, they can see that. But we'll
And
put it in
Bobby, I
all
have
the
one other
places.
thing to mention, which is Cheryl and I had a couple of just wonderful, rip roaring conversations on the podcast Novel Conversations, which will go live, I think, right now on YouTube. And so, of course, that'll be once it's made its debut, it'll be available anytime, and it's just very fun.
Yes. And if
And we
you
tried
send
really hard today not to duplicate too much.
Exactly.
well, I hope that I helped in asking
Yes.
different
You
questions.
did, of course, you did.
And we will also share those on our Facebook page as well. So we will make those available, and we can probably put them. I think we can probably put them on Cheryl's website as well. We'll try to figure that out. See if we can get that to work. But I just want to say this was wonderful. It was great meeting you, quote unquote, in person, Mara. I know we've been emailing quite a bit. And Sherryl, as always, just lovely to see you. And go read good books, people.
Yes. Thank you all. Nice
Thank
to
you.
see
Thank you
you.
so much. It's just